Hello, everybody. We're back. So sorry about the technical issues. We think we've solved it now. I did say that earlier, but that didn't quite work out. We are confident that it works now. The live stream is just up on our website now, with no logins, no password. You can just watch it now. Apologies for that, comrades. We also decided to postpone the session on the Republic to tonight, 8:30. For about 45 minutes, because on the Ukraine session earlier, and we did an improvised session with Craig Murray and Kevin Bean, but we hadn't heard the opposing view, and we actually are quite keen to have a proper debate on these issues. So we said we want to have that debate, especially now with Simon Pirani, who has a different viewpoint from the other speakers we've heard. Unfortunately, Craig Murray had to leave, but we now got Roger to introduce this session. Apologies, and see you later.
Right, hi comrades. Apologies for the false start, but here we are. It's hard to remember, but 30 years ago, the world's capitalists were celebrating what they called the end of history. And since then, history has given its own riposte in the shape of the deepest slump since the 1930s, the deadliest pandemic since 1918, the most rampant inflation since the 1970s, and the most imminent threat of nuclear Armageddon since 1962. And that's before we even begin to consider the fact that the world is hurtling towards ecological catastrophe. The Ukraine war is the first major war involving a nuclear superpower since 1945. And war certainly shakes things up. The shock of the First World War toppled the dynasties of Europe and precipitated a wave of revolutions. But its first casualty was the Socialist International, which it shattered into fragments. And this war, too, has opened up sharp and sudden rifts among fellow socialists. And we're proud to host here an open forum in which we can debate these crucial differences democratically. Now, I'm sorry to say that we were going to have Richard Brenner and Craig Murray on our platform, and both would have added a lot to the debate. But because of the logistical problems, I'm afraid they are not available now. But we do have, we're very happy to have Simon Pirani, who's a Labour movement activist, a writer on Russia, Ukraine, and energy systems, and honorary professor at the University of Durham. And we also have Richard Sakwa, former professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent, honorary professor in the Faculty of Political Science at Moscow State University, and author of several books on Russia and Eastern Europe. And before asking them to open the debate, I'd like to invite our audience to consider two relevant quotations. The first comes from the USA's former CIA director and former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, who has declared, quote, that the USA, backed by the whole of NATO, is in a long proxy war with Russia, with Ukraine as the battlefield. And the second is by Vladimir Putin, who has dismissed Ukraine's very national identity as an artificial construct created, as he put it, by Bolshevik communist Russia, adding the menacing message, "We are ready to show you what genuine decommunization means for Ukraine." So the questions are, is Russia turning the clock back to recreate a prison house of nations, as Lenin described the Tsarist Empire? And is the USA using the Ukraine war as a stepping stone towards a coming world war with Russia and China? And where should socialists stand in this conflict? I'm not sure which of you wants to open. Simon? Simon, you start then, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Roger. Thanks for inviting me to join the panel. I'm sorry we had these technical difficulties. I want to just reflect very quickly on what good panels like this or gatherings like this can do. I'm speaking slightly into the ether. There's a live stream, I understand, and people can watch this subsequently on the internet. If I say something you don't like, or you do like, I have a blog It's People Nature, all one word, peoplenature.org. You can email me there. I'm very happy, and there's a lot there about what I think about Ukraine, and I'm very happy to correspond with people. I mean, the reason I've joined today is because I think that we have to find ways of discussing what are very deep and serious differences on life and death issues. I mean, I've got 5 points here I was going to make. I'll adapt them slightly in the sense that the panel has changed. I'm kind of generally aware of Richard's view. I've known him for many, many years. He was very supportive to me when I was doing my studying, but now we don't have the other panelists. So the first point I want to make is about the character of the Russian war. In my view, Russia is a weakened empire desperately trying to restore its imperial status. It emerged from the breakup of the Soviet Union as an economically subordinate power, supplying the world capitalist economy with raw materials and pumping oligarchs' wealth into the financial system. Under Putin since 2000, it sought to make up for economic weakness by military means. In the Second Chechen War, Russia pulverized Chechnya and its population rather than allow aspirations for national autonomy or independence to take root. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 and, of course, intervened in Syria to support a dictator who drowned citizens in blood rather than allow them democratic freedoms. Now, the strongest imperialist powers basically tolerated all of this, and despite their denials, essentially had Russia act as a gendarme of capital in its sphere of influence. Russia's pretensions to imperial status have been most evident in its interventions in Ukraine. It's one of Russia's oldest colonies. Denying Ukrainian national rights was always integral to Russian imperial thinking. And of course, there's the speech that Roger referred to, claiming that historically Ukraine is not a nation. I think the other way of looking at this is that the imperialist character of Russia's war is evident from the military methods used. This is an imperialist force seeking to subjugate an enemy population. Putin said Russian soldiers would be greeted with flowers. There's not a single recorded case, but there are plenty of examples of Ukrainians trying to resist the Russian army with their bare hands. There have been massacres of civilians, rape used as a weapon, torture, forcible conscription, forcible deportation, all methods perfected by the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, as was the method of forcing into the army men from the poorest regions, disproportionately from ethnic minorities. The targeting of politicians, journalists, and activists in occupied areas seems a bit more like the US empire in the 20th century. I recommend the 2 reports on violations of human rights law by the OSCE. They spare no detail on alleged war crimes by Ukrainian soldiers, particularly against those accused of collaboration with Russia. They also conclude, however, that the vast majority of war crimes have been committed by the Russian side, the vast majority. All this makes nonsense of the claims by some people in the labor movement that this is a war between 2 equal sides. Why in February did Ukrainians, whatever their dissatisfaction with their own government, and I can assure you there was plenty, volunteer in large numbers? In my view, it's because they are resisting an imperialist assault, and therefore the labor movement should provide practical material solidarity to working class communities that are bearing the brunt of this assault. Trade unionists from the UK, France, Austria, and other places have organized convoys of aid to workers in the frontline areas. I would ask everyone here whether they support such initiatives. And do you agree that Ukrainians have the right to defend themselves with arms? I do, in the same way as I believe that Palestinians faced with apartheid Israeli occupation have that right. The second point is about NATO, because obviously it's NATO that is currently supplying the Ukrainian government with weapons and will continue to. In their view, their gendarme has gone rogue and needs to be brought back under control. But that weapon supply, like the applications by Sweden and Finland to join NATO, are results of the invasion, not causes. The idea that NATO expansion was the cause of the invasion is one-sided false logic. An honest assessment of Russia's relationship with NATO would show that that expansion into Eastern Europe belongs essentially to the 1990s, that point of Russian weakness. The last big group of East European countries applied to join NATO in 1999 and actually joined in 2004. The Russian state, buoyed by the oil boom of the 2000s, since then sought to increase its control over its sphere of influence with little interference by the NATO powers. And you could look, for example, at the character of the sanctions imposed in 2014 in respect of Crimea. They were certainly damaging, very damaging to Russian business, but it was essentially a Kremlin decision to subordinate economic management to nationalist and imperialist aims. Analytically, I would define Russia as a creature of the larger powers and a creature of capitalist crisis, and not as an opposite to them. The third point is about proxy war, because the false claim that NATO expansion was the chief cause of the war is linked to the false proposition that Ukrainians are fighting a proxy war for NATO. So the Future of the Left website says, quote, Putin is no friend of the working class, but neither are Zelensky or NATO. Although the direct fighting in Ukraine is between the Russian and Ukrainian states, no mention there of the Ukrainian population at all, many see this war in effect as a proxy war between Putin and the US. Now, this false logic could be applied to any number of situations. Spain in 1936, you could say, quote, Franco's, this is me making up the quote, this is not a quote from anybody, but it's the way this approach could look in Spain in 1936, quote, Franco's no friend of the working class, but neither are the Republican government or the Allied powers. Although the direct fighting is between nationalists and Republicans, many see this war as one between the Axis and the Allies. No room for the international brigades there. Vietnam in 1972, quote, again, made up quote, the US is no friend of the working class, but neither are the Soviet and Chinese leaders. Although the direct fighting is by the Vietnamese army, many see this as a proxy war between Moscow and Washington. Little need to support Vietnamese resistance from that standpoint. To my mind, the difference is that in Ukraine, we're dealing with Russian imperialism, not German, American, or British imperialism. And in the labor movement, we see a bogus Western-centered form of anti-imperialism, in quotes, people who believe crudely that the main enemy is US imperialism and my enemy's enemy is my friend. This thinking is ruinous to international solidarity, just as ruinous as the support given by elements in the labor movement to Tony Blair's imperial adventure in Iraq. It just serves the Kremlin. So a final point is about the so-called republics in the Donbass. A key claim of Kremlin propaganda was that the invasion in February was motivated by a desire to defend Russian-speaking Ukrainians from Ukrainian nationalism. On one level, we could just say that the sincerity of that can be judged by the number of Russian-speaking Ukrainians that the Russian army have killed, raped, and driven from their homes. But I think we need to deal with the claim a bit further. It's still made, and we hear echoes of it in the labor movement. We need to look back far further than 2014, but for now, let's at least look that far back. We had the Maidan uprising, a truly mass movement, politically confused and complex, but directed above all against the government of Viktor Yanukovych and the Party of Regions, which represented Eastern Ukrainian capital, the owners of mines, steelworks, and other industries. That party spared no effort to sow division between Ukrainians on the basis of language, and in response to the Maidan uprising, that party encouraged the anti-Maidan movement that sought autonomy for Eastern regions and had support from substantial numbers of working class people. Right-wing Ukrainian nationalism stoked these divisions from the other side, but these tensions were turned into military conflict by the Russian army fighting alongside extreme Russian nationalist and fascist volunteers. They put in place the two republics, under which the economy of those areas was trashed and half the population left. Tin pot dictatorships were established without the most elementary observance of civil or labor rights. There's an analogy with Ireland. Working class Protestants long formed the support base not only for orange political parties, but for armed loyalist paramilitaries. Traditionally, socialists understood that the power underpinning all this was British imperialism. We did not parrot calls for a unionist six-county state or pretend that working class attitudes to that state weakened the case for a united Ireland. We called for troops out. I've got some more points about the labour movement response, but I think you're trying to keep it brief. So I'll end by saying that as things stand in the labour movement, this bogus anti-imperialism is undermining the internationalist principles on which Chartists supported Irish liberation in the 1840s and on which many of us here supported Vietnamese liberation in the 1970s. And it's those principles of internationalism that should guide labour movement action now with regard to Ukraine.
Oh, thank you, Simon, for a very forthright and also succinct presentation of your point of view. Richard, over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. And thank you very much, Simon, for a powerful and presentation there. I was going to take a slightly different tack. So just to say, of course, glad to be part of this discussion, which I think is absolutely essential for us to discuss these things in a civilized, rational manner. And clearly, if we're talking about in the framework of the future of the left, these issues are fundamentally important, as we've just heard. It is obviously any left has to be far more than just simply electoral victories. It has to be based on underpinned by a clear foundation of ideas. And the ideas, one which I want to focus on today, is the notion of anti-militarism. And I agree with Simon that we do need a more theoretically developed vision of anti-imperialism, and not simply knee-jerk condemnation of one side or the other. But the idea for anti-militarism, I think, can provide a useful intellectual foundation to develop ideas, because obviously this debate is taking place in the framework of for a long time, since 2014 at least, we've been talking about a second Cold War, and that the second Cold War has now moved into a new phase, which is, you could argue, the foothills of the Third World War. And obviously we then have an ethical responsibility to avert further escalation, and that's the spirit and the framework in which I make my comments. And so this anti-militarism is the framework. Is astonishing how, in the last few years, how the center of gravity of thinking has moved so far to not to the left, but not even simply to the right, because the right itself, interestingly enough, has been able to generate a critique which in some ways has been more convincing and certainly more powerful than the left in condemning the militarism, which in my view has been at the basis of this conflict at the moment. That in the United States, for example, traditional national interest group or interest conservatives are now paradoxically far more critical of the militant universalist politics of the Atlantic powers than most of the modern left. And worse than that, the leftist ideas of peace movements and so on have been a particular target of criticism of those who look to some sort of military solution to this crisis at the moment. So the moderate left is now firmly in the liberal interventionist neoconservative primacy camp. This is a disastrous, both politically and, in my view, also intellectually. So how did we get there? So basically, I'm arguing that we have a political West took shape during the Cold War. That this political West, its instruments obviously are NATO and a whole economic paraphernalia, which I won't go into, but this is based on and also hub and spoke alliances with in Japan and in Asia. So it was this political West that Gorbachev during Perestroika tried to change, and this is what the new political thinking was all about. So in other words, this political West is different from the cultural and civilizational West, but it's a political West, very specific form of a US-dominated alliance system with all sorts of positive values within that, progressive values, but ultimately a type of militarized body. And for example, this is, Michael Glennon, for example, has done this excellent work on the dual state in the United States, where he says that during the Cold War, the Trumanite state, the one that condemned by that communist Eisenhower in his farewell address when he condemned the military-industrial complex, that this Trumanite state was effectively overshadowing the Madisonian states. That's the Madisonian state. That's the instruments of popular democracy, elections, representation, free media, and all the rest. And so that this militarized state has been able to shape the discourse and the debate and so on. This is what 1989 was initially about. Gorbachev sought the transformation of this to say that the end of the Cold War would mean a transformation of this political West, keeping the good things, but to end its militarized vision of international order. And of course, in Gorbachev's obituaries, just in the last few weeks, it's been astonishing how his transformative agenda, and I'm summarizing very briefly, has been completely forgotten. Instead of which, it was all the talk of how he led the collapse of the Soviet Union and the peaceful end of the Cold War. His absolutely radical vision of this new post-Cold War order was completely forgotten and suppressed. And it's astonishing to do so. So this is the Gorbachev that's like. So what was this transformation? The whole appeal was that in 1945, we established what I call the Charter International System, based on the UN, based on sovereign internationalism. Instead of which, after 1989, instead of this sovereign internationalist vision, this is the vision and articulated in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, just recently restated in the Samarkand Declaration in December, meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization leaders with the BRICS and so on, and the Global South, which very much in keeping with the Bandung Declaration and so on. So there is an anti-imperialism out there, which is very powerful, very effective, but very much suppressed in the heartlands of capitalist modernity, and including now, astonishingly, by the left itself, which is really astonishing. What we're talking about was a return to those fundamental principles of sovereign internationalism, which are embedded in the UN Charter. Instead of which, and that was what Gorbachev allowed the whole end of the Cold War, by appealing to these Charter international system principles, instead of which we got this political West claims it intervenes. It claims to have been the victor in this. Of course, Russia and China and many other states, India, are not going to be happy with this. So it's quite clear that this was a complete travesty of what Gorbachev was trying to do. And the specific, NATO enlargement is both important, and on the other hand, it isn't. Because on the one side, clearly, it isn't just Putin opposed to NATO enlargement. It was Yeltsin, of course. In December 1994, he condemned the Cold Peace in quite violent terms. They assumed that partnership for peace would be the way forwards, and the idea of NATO enlarging against all the promises at the time of German unification. However, even NATO enlargement may have been fine for all sorts of good reasons, stops conflict between its members, above all Greece and Turkey and so on. But even one of the most ardent partisans of NATO enlargement, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his grand chessboard, said, of course, NATO enlargement must be accompanied, he says, by an overarching security framework so that Russia does not get excluded. And so many other writers also who were very concerned, Kennan and even William Perry, former US defense minister, and so on, have always argued you needed an overarching framework. So today, within the absence of transformation, we saw the subversion of the autonomy of the Charter international system. And it's taking place in a way in which they create, an alliance for democracies, for a discussion now for G12, the United States and its allies, to act as a substitute for the autonomy of international law and of the Charter international system. So that's the context in which this conflict took place. And so to talk about Russian imperialism, yes, I agree with Simon quite strongly there, that in all sorts of ways, the development of Russia in the last few years has been deeply pathological and especially intensified after 2019, after the Moscow Duma elections and the repression and so on. But if restoration of empire at that point was the key idea, then in 2014, as many of the nationalists called for, then there would have been far more than just simply Crimea. It doesn't help explain why, for so many years, Moscow was trying to have the implementation of the Minsk II agreement for the Donbass, which was a formula for their restoration and return to Ukrainian sovereignty, which in my view was absolutely the right way forwards. Obviously, it would have meant a transformation of the Ukrainian state. But this transformation from external, obviously the elite didn't like it. But this transformation would have been something which I've been calling for since 1996. And that is that when I saw that 1996 constitution, Ukrainian constitution, it was almost unbelievable that it presented itself as a monolingual, ethnicized state, a la Estonia or Latvia. Absolutely shocking development. And this is, of course, has been generating conflict ever since. Now, it's absolutely right that, and under the pressure of invasion, people, everybody from all, whatever nationality, whatever group, have rallied to the legitimate state. And so it's quite understandable, of course. And, rallying to its defense is quite normal. But that doesn't take away the fact that the Ukrainian state has been developing for the last since the mid-1990s, in repudiation of its very fundamental declaration of state sovereignty in 1990 as a neutral state, as a tolerant, pluralistic state. Yes, it accepted and gave citizenship to all of its members in 1991. But after that, the state project was effectively hijacked. We have many other countries, Canada, Wales, many others, multilingual, multicultural, to take joy in its diversity. Instead of which, after the Maidan, whatever you want to call it, coup pollution, revolution type coup, you have quite clearly a virulent nationalist, ethnicized form of state building has developed, of course, alienating people. I've spoken to, and one shouldn't take away the subjectivity of the citizens of the Donbass, leaving aside the Crimea. I've spoken to many people in the Donbass. Books would show it that, yes, of course, a rather unpleasant authoritarian systems there, but overwhelming support for this vision initially, certainly a vision. They didn't want separatism. They were autonomists of a vision of a pluricultural, multilingual, constitutionally entrenched federal system, or elements of it. It doesn't have to be federal as such, in Ukraine. So again, there were a lot of tensions involved in it. And let me just finish to say, what sort of pathways for peace are we talking about now? If we are in the foothills of the Third World War, what do we do? Okay, more military aid to Ukraine. Well, where does that end? What is the goal? Is it to liberate not just the parts occupied since the 24th of February, but does this mean Donbass as well and Crimea? Well, this is absurd. And Crimea has been part of it. Overwhelming majority of the Crimean population wants to be with Russia. Of course, I'm not endorsing the way it took place in 2014, but given state breakdown at that time, it's understandable. So also, what are the limits? A word about sanctions, intensification of sanctions. We have never seen sanctions of this form before. We're talking about holding a whole nation collective in terms of collective guilt and collective punishment. Always when there were sanctions in the past, even Iraq, Iran, and so on, the discussion was not to harm ordinary people. The absolute unlimited, total nature of these sanctions, they now calculate up to 10,000 of them. And there's endless talk of yet more and more and more. Is this really what we want? Is this what any normal left movement would say, that this militarism, military escalation, economic warfare escalation, and no serious path? So the goal, what? Defeat of Russia? Well, maybe it will be defeated. Regime change within Moscow? Well, we may wish for it. A more democratic, post-imperial formation, but they're now talking even of an anti-post-colonial Russia. Let's break it up into 35 different statelets. So, in other words, it's this extraordinary, unlimited, total nature of the demands is almost clinical insanity, in my view. Clinical insanity, that we're in the foothills of a third world war. Okay, let's put yet more fire. Let's put more fuel on this flame. Let's fight this. This isn't to say that Ukraine, we always wanted it, a sovereign, democratic, free Ukraine. That was the goal. That was on offer for so long. They messed it up. We messed it up. Russia messed it up. So it's a march of folly on all sides, as I argue in a paper earlier, on all sides, and therefore behooves us, I think, those of us who want to have a vision of free societies developing in partnership, is to support that. So we really have to, it's not, and it isn't a question of punishing the Russian people. Absolutely, it's damaging. It will probably survive. But also, don't forget also the global south in all of this. I've mentioned Shanghai Cooperation, the BRICS and others. This is yet another war of the global north, a civil war in itself, like the First World War, Second World War. It's as if we can simply not get beyond our own, this is our Eurocentric, into endless intra-imperial wars. We need to move beyond all of that. So we need an agenda which can get beyond it. And the only way to do it is to defend the autonomy of the UN-based Charter International System established in 1945, not special rules-based orders or special subgroups who claim to speak for behalf of all of humanity. We have this Charter International System. It is under the gravest threat since it was established in 1945. We need to go back to its fundamental principles, including dialogue and diplomacy, which has already been undermined well before the Ukraine crisis, but now completely devastated. The world faces a challenge and a moment of danger which it has not seen since 1945. And we really need to step back, de-escalate, demilitarize, and think of how we can then go back to these fundamental charter ideas, which include, of course, human rights, sovereign development, and respect for diversity. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Richard for a very clear and informative statement of your position. Look, we have just 15 minutes left of the session. I think if we have any quick questions or quick comments from the disappointingly small audience who are here at the moment, but I hope that there's a lot more on the live stream or who will be watching this on recording online later. John, Steve, or Jackie, do you want to speak? Do you want to say anything? John, you're muted, John.
Only to say I'd welcome the opportunity to hear more from two very well-informed speakers who've managed to avoid the usual cliches which are characterised by this debate. So, yeah, I think I would welcome some more exchange.
I too. Steve or Jackie or anybody else out there? Steve, you're muted as well.
Yeah. Just to say, I'm largely in sympathy with what Simon said. I'd like to say, as that's my position. I support, first of all, as far as this, the Ukrainian working class. I support the idea of an independent Ukraine as a democratic and social republic. It isn't a democratic and social republic. It isn't that. It is being essentially a republic of oligarchs, dominated by oligarchs. I obviously oppose the partition of Ukraine, and I oppose the annexation of any part of Ukraine by Russia. But I also recognise it is an inter-imperialist situation between Russia and America. And in that sense, we support the Ukrainian working class. We don't support the American or British interventions in that war. And in fact, if we were to oppose our own ruling class, the best thing that we could do to stop this situation would be to deal with our own undemocratic system, the fact that we don't have in this country a democratic and social republic. So I think that we have to oppose our own ruling class whilst fundamentally supporting the Ukrainian working class and all the rights, civil liberties, free speech of the Ukrainian working class. And that doesn't put us at odds either with the ordinary people of Russia, by the way, because they've been led into this to back Putin because they've been kept in the dark or repressed. So I think, supporting the Ukrainian working class, supporting the Russian working class, and opposing our own ruling class, its war efforts, and selling arms probably and providing weapons and all those other things which it's doing. And of course, America's the big player in this, but Britain, we're not living in America, we're living in Britain. So in a certain sense, we should be criticising our own ruling class, its role in this. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Steve. Jackie, do you want to speak? Are you there? Okay, well, comrades, look, there's only 10 minutes. I think we must ask Simon and Richard if they want to have a last word. Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. I mean, look, the first thing is I hope that this conversation continues, and I would like to find a format whereby that can happen. So let's set that as a modest aim for ourselves. I think it's regrettable that there's no Ukrainian labour movement voice, but if we're going to be on Zoom, that's entirely possible to organise. And in fact, of course, since February, there's been a constant stream of Russian labour movement and other dissident activists who are now far flung around all the European capitals. And, again, if we're on Zoom, there's no reason why we wouldn't be able to get those people into a conversation. So I think this must continue. I mean, just a few quick responses to Richard's points. You're hanging a lot on the idea that the Western push in the 1990s, and then, of course, centrally, the war on Iraq in 2003 was a travesty of Gorbachev's vision. But I don't recognize your Gorbachev. I mean, Gorbachev was very much, was forced to do what he was doing. He was very much a victim of circumstance, and whatever vision he had was secondary to the huge objective changes that were taking place at that time. And I think there are arguments similar to yours which say that, the West had a golden opportunity in the 90s that it could have supported a much more liberal form of power in Russia. But, all that assumes that capital would not inevitably and sort of without anybody pushing it would suck everything it could out of the former Soviet space in terms of stolen wealth, in terms of capital flight in the 1990s, and that an oligarchical setup with a new version of the very, very strong Russian state would be imposed. And of course, the victims of that were in Chechnya, which was a war which was fully supported actually by the NATO powers. So I think it's nice to dream about this Gorbachev's vision and the fact that it was trashed. But we have to deal with the capitalist world that we're actually living in. I could not disagree with you more strongly than when you say that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization represents some sort of anti-imperialism. As somebody who's always thought of myself as an anti-imperialist, it's not it's not an anti-imperialism that I would want to embrace. I think there are many movements in the global south and that we socialists in the global north should support, but I just don't see this collection of states in that part of the world as being one of those. Two last points. First of all, you I think you're laying it on a bit thick in relation to the Ukrainian constitution and the direction of Ukrainian statehood. I mean, in the 1990s, the Ukrainian state was a mess, and the predominant approach, which was perfected by Leonid Kuchma, was to balance between Europe and Russia. And that balance was then disrupted by the Orange Revolution of 2004, by and then the election of Yanukovych, and those divisions in Ukraine began to deepen. But I don't recognize this. I don't recognize your view that the predominant trend was to establish this monolingual state. I mean, I recognize that there were Ukrainian members of parliament going right back through that whole period who used the language issue, especially at election times, to try to play on those divisions, as fascist and divisive forces all across the world do. But I don't recognize that had any significant impact. Of course, there's now been a language law passed under Zelensky under the pressure of this new stage of conflict, and it's a law that, I mean, all the Ukrainian friends I know in the labor movement don't like. It's also a law that, like many laws in Ukraine, not everybody pays an awful lot of attention to. That's not to minimize the seriousness of those divisions. It's to say that it's to underline the point that the last thing it needed to deal with those issues was the Russian army and the extreme nationalists, the Chechen volunteers that came with it in 2014. The last point is about sanctions. If anybody from Iraq or Iran is listening online, I don't think they would agree with you that there was no collective punishment inherent in those sanctions. I think there was. I think there's an element of that, because again, that's the way capitalism works. There's an element of that in the current sanctions. And I think that the labour movement can develop, and there have been some efforts to try to develop an independent view of the sanctions issue. I mean, we know where we'd start in the UK. We'd start with oligarchs' money, which still kind of comes and goes pretty much, not entirely unobstructed since February, but they still, find ways around the barriers and still feel themselves very much at home in, I was going to say Boris Johnson's London. Of course, the guard has changed for the moment. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Simon. Richard.
So on the final point, maybe I put it badly. Of course, there was collective punishment in Iran, and there still is, and Iraq earlier. I just meant that these sanctions were accompanied by the need not to avoid to damage the civilian population, and it's just simply the rhetoric of that is missing now. So I agree with you completely on that. As for the model of Ukrainian statehood, you're absolutely right again that it wasn't a mess in the 1990s. That multivectorism was the Leonid Kuchma approach, which I also condemned, because multivectorism was like a weather vane politics, swinging back to one side or the other depending on where the wind was strongest. What I was suddenly calling for was a principled position, and to go back to the statement of the Declaration of State Sovereignty, which was Ukraine to develop as a neutral state, just like Austria, Ireland, and many other, Cyprus, many other states. It was not. It's a noble position. It's not a failure not to be neutral, and so that's the first thing that this multivectorism, neutrality should have been developed far more positive, positive neutrality rather than just simply, moving between Russia and the West, as it were. But more than that, you're absolutely right, of course, that the harshness of the laws is mitigated by the fact they don't apply them. But what I'm looking at is the theoretical level, the 1996 Constitution, and of course all the debates, and of course under Kravchuk earlier, that the failure right from early on, and I've been having this debate for 30 years with people. Yes, Russian language was, most of the media, lots of the television was in Russian, and so on. Yet, for example, I was teaching in Dnipropetrovsk, as it used to be called, in the early 2000s, and over in Dnipro, as it's now called, overwhelmingly Russophone part of the country, and yet we were not allowed to teach and work in Russian. Now, I'm in favor, and I've always been strongly in favor of the development of the Ukrainian language, that I think it should have been compulsory, and it should be compulsory to be taught up to a certain level. So we're not simply, privileging the former language of the Afghan, but, Russian language was not just something which was imposed from outside. It was the language of the people in the south and the Donbass. So it's not as if it was imported. It was, if you were going to take the territories as were given in 1922 by Lenin to this Ukrainian state, then, part of that deal would be you risk the rights of the people who you were given, as it were, transferred without their permission and without their questioning back in 1922, a point which Putin makes in a way which I certainly don't endorse. But the substance of it is not a Putinite idea. It's an idea which we've been discussing for a long time. And what I find so disturbing is that so often even the open discussion of these issues is delegitimated. Are you just being a pro-Soviet, pro-Kremlin, I'm not saying you're saying that, but, the fact that these debates are, they should have been open. And when I did put this forward in my book in 2015, Frontline Ukraine, when I did say, Russia, the ethnic vision of Ukrainian development can at its best be generous, open-hearted, and it's certainly been very tolerant, Jewish and other people. So that's, I accept that. I understand it. I even understand the nationalist impulse to build a state after, years of neocolonialism and what have you may say. But the fundamental question, which I've been saying for 30 years, means that this language rights should have been constitutionally entrenched. And so when I was in Dnipropetrovsk, I said, look, we were all speaking Russian, but it was against the law. And so people, it's just insane way of developing it. And so that was false. And it has generated tensions more and more. And when you argue that the Russian people have been kept in the dark, plenty of stuff kept in the dark, I accept that as well. But on the whole, I've been there talking to people. There is a sort of grim determination that, this is something which has been foisted on Russia by this militarism, by this unmitigated enlargement of the political West after the end of the Cold War. And let me just, final point, to go back to Gorbachev. I understand what you're saying there, but Gorbachev's vision wasn't just Gorbachev. It was the idea, which to this day is fundamentally important to any left anti-imperialism and anti-militarism, is to say, look, we have an international system, the one established in 1945. Let's make it work based on sovereign internationalism. This is where the Shanghai Cooperation Organization comes in as well. Let countries find their own destinies, their own paths to development and modernization, not simply being dominated and said there's one path of modernity. It's a very good path, the Western path of modernity, in all sorts of ways. It is progressive and very positive, leaving aside the economic capitalist issue. But, on the other hand, it is, there's other paths, the Chinese paths to modernity. We may criticize it as much as we like, but the whole point is sovereign internationalism. Anyway, it looks like we have to end. So thank you for the discussion.
It's been a fantastic discussion. I wish it could go on longer. I wish more people had been able to contribute. I hope that that the live streaming has worked properly. And I hope very much that the recording is available and it will be watched by many people. I think it's been a really very, very useful discussion. I thank both the speakers and everybody who has taken part. Thank you, comrades. Bye-bye.
That was interesting, wasn't it? Thank you, comrades, for